Elden Ring has been a crazy ride. And not only for me, it seems to have brought so many people into the Souls-like's crazily dedicated community that it is. I mean, I even think it blew some of FromSoft's minds. From the Prepare to Cry edition with Vati Vidya to breaking the game as much as possible in one punch with Inferno Plus. This game has taken the world by storm, and it did for quite a while. People have shown that they absolutely love this game, from the amount of content that's been made of it, to even just the things that people have made about Elden Ring. But the game still has its issues, but we'll get to them at time. For the moment, here is my Elden Ring is an action-adventure role-playing game, though, due to the amount of Souls-likes there are, or Souls games there are, people would just call this a Souls-like. That means that a lot of these games are built to replicate the Dark Souls, Demon Souls, and Souls experience that FromSoft have so readily made available for us. Now, I haven't played every Souls-like out there, but I have played through a fair few of them. If you're interested, we'll be playing through a few of the ones that I haven't quite finished on the channel before. Though, the main Souls-likes I have played are Dark Souls 1 and 3, and I loved both of them. As well as a little bit of Demon Souls and Bloodborne, which we will continue on the channel. Elden Ring is what I would consider the best Souls-like to date. It takes the best aspects of the other FromSoft games that they have created, and they have mashed them into this. With one of the largest open worlds that we have experienced in a Souls-like, this game, even while Harry and I were playing it together, we were stunned by how large the map continued to grow. We thought Limgrave was going to be a large enough area, but we had no idea how large the map was. And the first thing that took my attention was the way this game looks. Compared to every other FromSoft game before it, this game looks gorgeous. Everything about it is so high quality, there is so much detail that has gone into it. It is incredible. Whether in the sunken towns of Lunaria, the terrifying swamps of Caelid, or the crumbling Farum Azula, it is always evident as to where you are. It is always very easy to tell where you are just by a simple glance. Usually. Though, even outside of that, enemies are greatly varied, and they are usually themed around the area you are in. I think there are knights for every dedicated area that you go through, all with their own colours and armour sets to go with them. Granted, they are all copied from the first ones you find in Lunaria, but the added colour sets are quite nice to come across, and it does bring some familiarity to the way you fight enemies throughout the game. Though, that doesn't mean that there aren't going to be new enemies you fight along the road. One issue I did have right off the bat is the guidance of grace. Now, what this is, when you have your grace, which is, for people who have played other FromSoft games, this is your bonfire for this game. What it tries to do, it tries to set you on a path to experience the most story, it seems. But it doesn't always seem to do its job very well. It can sometimes take you opposite directions, it's not very clear where it wants you to go, it just points to important things in the area. The next thing that FromSoft didn't seem to fix is the way they tell their stories. Now, this is something I've always kind of had an issue with. While I like the story in their games, the way they tell it is quite convoluted. You need to be searching for it a lot of the time, and even when you search for it, a lot of the time it doesn't make much sense until you already know what you're looking for, especially when it comes to NPCs. If you are trying to follow NPC storylines, you are going to need a guide outside of the game. And I'm not kidding, both Harry and I have needed guides multiple times just to figure out where the these characters are going. Not only that, but if you miss a single interaction, if you accidentally go and sit at a place of grace before you talk to certain characters, they can just disappear, either skipping over a large part of their story or just completely destroying their storyline altogether. It is really annoying when you're trying your best to follow a character, and then you go through a guide because you haven't seen them for a while, and you realize that you just missed them, and now you cannot complete that character's story anymore. It's kinda ridiculous. The combat in this game both makes and breaks it. It has some incredibly amazing points. I feel like you can go through nearly any playstyle and have it work, though some do outclass others quite a bit. Fighting enemies in this game is always a great experience, as it is with any other game if you're looking for a difficult game. Just like any other Souls-like, the fighting revolves around the idea of learning your enemy's attack patterns and striking when you can. Though, as usual, if these enemies are in large groups, they will abuse you until you die. While others, like a Crucible Knight, are just incredibly strong against you on their own. Now, something you're going to experience me saying a lot is that this game, especially the bosses that we're talking about now, has some incredibly strong points and some incredibly weak points. By the way, if you have not continued through the story of Elden Ring, I suggest you stop here or skip to the end, because this part is going to be talking about spoilers about bosses specifically. I'm going to be talking about hard bosses, the final boss, all of that stuff. Do not get mad at me if you make this mistake. Now, through my main playthrough, I played Sorcery. Compared to a lot of other Souls-likes, this Sorcery build was outstanding. It was so fun to use, and even though some bosses were incredibly resistant to it, it still seemed to just melt all the time. Though again, not as much as other builds. One thing that I struggled greatly with, and I feel like I would have no matter what, is one thing that is used quite liberally throughout the entire game. The worst of all being tree spirits. I do not mind this boss, but the situations they put you in while fighting it are absolutely ridiculous. There are times when a lot of the time this enemy winds up massively for an attack, but because you're in such a tight corridor, it's winding up through a wall, so you can't see what it's going to do, and then it just comes through the wall and kills you. I very much dislike the fact that you are putting an enemy that does large sweeping attacks inside of tight corridors that even the player can sometimes struggle moving around in. Like the ones placed in the sewers? What the fuck was that? So yes, for one of the smaller bosses of the game, I feel like the Tree Spirit is probably my most hated out of all of them. And if we're talking about other bosses, then... So first comes Radagon. Now Radagon in itself, especially with the mage build, is fairly easy. If you are outside of most of his attacks, then you can kind of just brush him off. Though, he is still incredibly fast and you still do get hit kind of often. But that's not the issue. Directly after Radagon is a creature known as the Elden Beast. This Elden Beast is incredibly brutal, but not in a good way. Now, just a bit of a meta thing here. The only thing the Elden Beast isn't resistant to is melee damage, so specifically physical damage. But the issue is that every time you get close to it, it leaves. Like, you might be able to get a single hit in, but it doesn't necessarily matter when it has something like 40,000 health. It will immediately run away from you and then spam you with attacks that home and do a stupid amount of damage. If you mess up once while fighting this boss, it will destroy you. This game was amazing overall until specifically this part. It legitimately destroyed my experience at the end of this game, and I have no idea why they decided to do this, specifically as the last boss. I understand that it's supposed to be hard, but you're not supposed to make something literally impossible. When I did do it with help from players, it was a lot more manageable. That doesn't mean it was easy, but it was manageable. You shouldn't need help from other people in a game just so you can finish the game. If I didn't have internet connection, I literally just would have quit the game. I tried for so long to get this boss killed, and it did not matter. It was stupid. And since we're on the issue of bosses that I don't like, there is another issue with certain bosses that are scattered around the map. Specifically the ones that if you have played this game, you probably know if you have visited these places at night. They are specifically the ones found in Caelid and the outskirts of Lendale. These are bell-bearing knights. Not only are they ridiculously hard, do they have an incredible amount of damage that they output, but their attacks track so insanely well that even when you dodge out of the way of them perfectly, they can still hit you. Even while being wildly overleveled, there are still two that I have not defeated, and it is specifically these two. I am so far overleveled for the first wipe that I have killed every boss in the game, but these two can still two-shot me with nearly max health. My health bar that you'll be able to see in these clips is literally over half of the screen, and they still two-shot that. As a last point, there are two more bosses that a lot of people seem to have issues with, but I didn't specifically. Those are Mohg and Millennia. Now, Mohg and Millennia are both incredibly brutal bosses, but when I was playing a mage build, I think they were a little bit broken. Both of them just kind of walked towards me and let me do whatever I wanted to them. It was very strange. Now, granted, I did use summons, I did use the Mimic tier. That does make things a lot easier, but also, compared to things like the Elden Beast, they were kind of pushovers. Especially Millennia's second phase. I did not have an issue with that at all. Now this is another kind of unfortunate point for the game. Multiplayer has kind of always been strange for Souls-likes, but specifically this one we ran into some issues with. Players are constantly faced with incredibly bad connections, and I'm not sure why. Even Harry and Harry would just get kicked from my game, or I would get kicked from his for next to no reason. Invaders will try to attack you and then you'll be hit after an incredible delay. It's very odd to experience. And also some of the restrictions as to where you can go are very odd. Like if you're in an area, you can't go into dungeons, which I kind of understand. But also there are certain rocks and walls that if you get on top of them, you'll just immediately be kicked. Though the areas that they allow you to be in is quite large, some of the things we wanted to do but we couldn't do together unless we left each other's match and then rejoined a couple minutes after it felt so restricting. It was a little bit ridiculous. And don't get me wrong, overall there were quite a few points in time when Harry and I had a great experience online, but the amount of connection issues just continued to stack up, and at some points genuinely made me want to stop playing the game for the day. It was very difficult to play this for long stances of time and try to keep a solid connection. With specifically multiplayer, I was really hoping that since it's such a large part of the game, they would make it a lot better than other FromSoft experiences, but with the balancing issues on top, it can get really unfun. Oh, speaking of, I want to start off by saying that using a bleed build, if you are using a bleed build, is terrible. You are a terrible person, and I hope you feel bad for using it. It is not fun to verse, it is not fun to play. It is the same spammy bullshit over and over again. It takes the fun out of nearly every enemy encounter. there is literally no point to use it, stop using it. Please, for the love of God, stop using it. Now, when we're talking about bleed builds, I'm specifically talking about one weapon that I showed earlier, Rivers of Blood. It is so annoying the amount of players that use this in PvP. In fact, I'm pretty sure nearly every single person I have versed in PvP, bar maybe 5, have used Rivers of Blood or have it as a backup weapon. You don't even need to level this a single time for it to be an effective killer in both PvP and out of PvP. It is the worst balanced thing I think I've ever experienced in my life. And not only that, but there are another 2 things that I used specifically that made most bosses an absolute cakewalk. That being the Moon, or I don't remember what it's called, but everyone just goes by the Moon, and Comet Azure. Comet Azure is literally a laser beam that you can just hold down, and with one of the potions you can build, you can just continue to hold it down for a good 30 seconds. It literally one-shots bosses. Not to mention, some of the summons you get access to are ridiculous. About midway through the game, mid to late way through the game, you get access to Mimic Tier, which literally just turns into a version of you with a shit ton more health, and I think probably does more damage than you do as well. I thought the point of the summons was to help, not to play the game for you. Now, I know that I just went on a long spree of shitting on this game, but also I want you guys to understand that these are outliers. A lot of the experiences I had in this game were amazing. It's just that I wanted to make points about specifically these things. That being said, I feel like if you play any build, you could get through the game, bar a couple experiences which are going to be incredibly hard. You may need to use online for specifically those bosses. Otherwise, I feel like you could use literally anything. Strength dex, even faith. Everything is incredibly well balanced, bar some things that are not at all. And the way that some of the bosses are balanced as well, you will have your hard fights thanks to resistances. Even bleed builds struggle against certain bosses because of the resistance to bleed, and that makes sense. But it just annoys me that certain builds like bleed and sometimes magic, you barely need to lift a finger to play most of the game at all. I feel like Elden Ring is probably one of the best experiences in gaming recently, especially coming from a large developer, which recently we have not had many good games coming out at all. I feel that FromSoft especially is probably one of the best developers as of recent. They have released some amazing games, they continue to release the same amazing games. Granted, their style does get a little boring, but they have seemingly perfected this type of game, or at least as much as we can consider coming from a AAA company. And as much as I shit on this game, I absolutely adore it. I thought that I would hate going back and playing it to get footage for this, but even playing through Millennia and Moog, the experience of traveling through these areas is outstanding. I cannot put enough time into this game. I think I have somewhere about 150 to 160 hours in the game, and a lot of games might be lucky to get about 6 hours out of me. So the question is Elden Ring worth your time? I would say, hell yes. So thank you for watching, thank you for sticking through the end. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one.